We're doing something different.
Be careful what you say about you.
I can remember going up there when I was a child.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday, February the 7th edition of Kiwanis Club in Cleveland in the great year of our Lord 2013. Today, our patriotic song would have been led by Jerry Arms, so I'm going to ask Andy if he would lead us in our patriotic song today. Our Pledge of Allegiance will be led by Larry Bentley, and our invocation by Larry Carpenter. Please face the flag.
My country 'tis a peace, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we pause today just to give you thanks for all the blessings that you've given us. We thank you for this club, this group of men and women that are trying to help out the youth in our community. God, today we ask that you would touch our leaders, national leaders, community leaders. God, that you would bless our economy. I ask that you would bless our families, the ones that are in need, that are sick and hurting. God, now we ask that you bless this food and our meeting. In your name we pray. Amen.
Very good. Do we have any guests today besides our guest speaker? Flipping around the room. Anyone? Nope. No guests today. Mystery Kiwanian. Who's our Mystery Kiwanian? Oh, Michelle, okay.
Yes, and as this person shook my hand, he said, maybe I'll get the mystery. I never get the mystery Kiwanian. Could be Alan.
All right, Alan, no. Alan, where would you like your $2 to go? Foundation or to eliminate maternal neonatal tetanus project, which is an international project? Foundation. $2 to foundation. All right. Okay, split the pot dollars. We had $27 in the pot. $13.50 goes to the winner. This is an opportunity, not the lottery. Pure disclosure for anyone who wants to know. We would like our guests to pick out one of the tickets, if you don't mind. Read the last three numbers off.
449.
449.
All right.
All right, pick another one out for a door prize. Look like we have what? Coffee tub, golf balls.
Plastic bag.
436.
436 for the door prize. Okay. She foregoes that. Announcements. Tracy Hamilton regarding Dr. Seuss Day.
Dr. Seuss Day is coming up. I'm very excited to tell you we already have 2 sponsors of books on board. You too can sponsor a book for $5 each. We'll add your logo to the book label inside. So far, Bank of Cleveland and Georgia Pacific are helping us out. So we need some more of you to come on board and help us out with our budget to help us give these books to these children. Thank you. Just contact me if you're interested.
Very good. So we got that. Kay Smith.
We had our first 4A public speaking contest last Friday. Had a great turnout on judges, great contest. Everything went very well. We were supposed to have had one tomorrow night, but I think Cleveland State couldn't handle us room-wise, so we had to move. And so our next one is on the 15th. Some of you have signed up, which is great, but we need more people because they tell me if this is 6th grade, 7th grade is going to be there, and we'll probably have around 7 rooms. That's 14 judges. So right now, each judge is going to judge by themselves right now. So anyway, let's see. Several weeks later, we have our county public speaking, that'll be on March 1st at Cleveland State, and that's on the second sheet. So I've got 3 sign-ups, and y'all just kind of share those from table to table. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay.
I need to be there by 6, and tomorrow night, on the 15th, there is a play there in the auditorium that starts at 6:30. So if parking is something you're concerned about, come a little bit earlier, because that's what they're telling us. There's a play, and it'll be right there where we are too, so we'll have to kind of look for everybody. Okay, thank you.
Good deal. Something else, and I sent this email out, announced it last week, just a quick reminder, we need to have about a 5 to 10 minute meeting, the Harlan White Citizen of the Year Award Committee. If you don't mind, please, just 5 or 10 minutes immediately after the meeting today, just to kind of organize something and kind of chit-chat real quick like. Also, those nomination forms, I don't know if they're back there or not. They're not. Good. The nomination forms, we got a deadline of February the 28th, but the quicker the better on those, so we can make a determination on those. But they do not have to be a member of the club. They just have to actually reside in Cleveland, Bradley County, okay? So any member of the club can nominate, and the ones, the 10 nominees do not have to be a member of the Kiwanis Club. It could be anyone in the community you feel that's lived up to that high standard that Harlan not only projected, but also lived in his own life. Also, just a reminder, we're having the Kiwanis Club of Cleveland Youth and Community Services Foundation Incorporated annual meeting. Just so you know, we're having that on Tuesday, next Tuesday, February the 12th, high noon up here. It'll be in Hallie's room right down the hallway here. Most definitely, if at all possible, I need the board of directors, the executive officers of the club, and as the foundation is set up, all members of the club are actually members of the foundation, okay? But primarily, we need to have this an annual meeting. I have a couple of items of business that I'm going to send out via email. That way you've got it also today, so you can kind of chew on that and talking about direction for the foundation, but also in terms of raising additional revenues for the foundation to grow it and invest more back into our local youth here in Cleveland and Bradley County. We'll read one last thing here, and I'll hush after this and turn it over to Alan. But the purposes and powers, I just want you to know this, what the purposes and powers of the foundation is, and I know it's morphed over the course of years and so forth, but I think it's important. A lot of times we talk about foundation, but we don't talk about what's in the text and the powers and the purposes of our foundation really is. Powers and purposes. The corporation is formed for the purposes for which a corporation may be formed under the Tennessee Nonprofit Corporation Act and not for pecuniary gain or benefit, direct or indirect, to its members. In way of explanation and not of limitation, the purposes for which it is formed are: 1, or A, to assist needy persons, particularly young people; B, to assist worthy youth in attaining educational excellence, and to aid handicapped persons in regaining happy, useful lives through the expending of funds directly for such purposes, or by the furnishing of funds to other organizations organized for charitable, scientific research, or educational purposes, or the prevention of cruelty to children, all within the purview of Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, as amended, and the regulations thereunder. That's what the foundation's purposes are in there. Just wanted to, sometimes a good little educational, 30-second educational opportunity. That's it. Do we have any other announcements from the floor? Seeing none, I'll turn it over to our, Vince.
Would you repeat that date again for that?
Tuesday, February the 12th, high noon. Next Tuesday here. And also February 19th is our regularly scheduled board meeting. Okay? Nothing else, I'll turn it over to Alan Winter, our February program chairperson.
Good afternoon, Kiwanians. How's everybody? I think you're in for a treat today. Ken Rush is curator of the Ducktown Museum. And if you've lived here for a significant number of years, you can remember traveling over to Copper Hill, that area, and it looked like it was, it was pretty bare at that time. Through the years, it is greened up a little bit. Trees have been planted, and but I don't want to steal any thunder from Ken's presentation, but Copper Hill was a thriving area at one time in Tennessee. And there was a lot of people employed there, and it was, I heard Ken speak last year over at the Copper Hill Club, and they were having a celebration over there, and I was very interested in his presentation, and I think you will be as well. I think it's very compelling to know a little bit about the history of that area. And, but Ken Rush hails from Brewston, Tennessee. He graduated in 1980 from high school there and received a degree from Middle Tennessee State University in 1989 on historic preservation. And he's married to his lovely wife, Sandra. And let's give a warm Kiwanis welcome to Ken Rush.
Thank y'all. Hoping the technology holds up here. As Alan said, I'm curator and director of the Ducktown Basin Museum, and we're tasked with preserving and interpreting the mining, smelting, and industrial history of the basin. The reality is, if not for those industries, there probably would not be communities there today, because after the removal of the Cherokee, where other areas saw a lot of people moving in to settle, if you've been to the basin, you know it's very up and down. There wasn't a lot of good farmland, so there were very few people that had actually moved into that region to settle, maybe a dozen or so families in the 5 or 6 years after it was opened. But once copper was discovered, within a few years of that, you had 1,000 people working there, and that was by the 1850. So the towns that became Copper Hill and McKaysville, Georgia, across the line, and Ducktown, and the community of Isabella, these all sort of grew up overnight. When we talk about boom towns, that's what was going on in the basin. And it wasn't always out west, so it did happen in this side of the country too. I'm going to run through these pretty fast and pause on some, but try to leave some time for questions. That's the view off the museum overlook. If you weren't aware, the mining in the basin was shaft mining. There's a couple of them went over 3,000 foot in depth. This is a cave-in into a portion of the mine that the museum sits near. We're on the Burra Burra mine site, but we're not over the mine. So if you're leery about coming up there, afraid it's going to fall in with you, we're standing on solid ground looking out over the mine in this ground. We get that question a lot. So, as you can imagine, the miners were pretty tough, hardy souls. This is an early photograph. The museum's located on the Burra Burra site. It's a photograph from 1917. The majority of these buildings in this photograph are still standing. This is the old clinic, which is now used. We let the Boy Scouts use that for a meeting place. This is the hoist house and the boiler plant. This is an earlier change house. We have a new one that was built in 1918 to replace that one. But our site contains about 10 structures on 17 acres. And it was one of the mines, but it was surface headquarters for all the mining. So there's 9 different deposits in the basin that were commercially mined, and Burra Burra was surface headquarters. So the building the main museum exhibits are in was originally the old engineering and mining, or excuse me, the engineering and geology offices. So that's where all mining in the basin was planned, not just at Burra Burra. And if you're wondering, that's an Australian name. When these mines were being discovered and developed in the 1850s, the Burra Burra was a very large working copper mine in Australia at that time. We don't know if there was a direct connection, but we know a lot of our early investors were English and probably had contacts with the operations in Australia as well. So Burra Burra is an Aboriginal word for large or great, so it's great. We're known for copper. Everybody talks about copper, but the reality is there was a lot more sulfur and other elements there in addition to the copper. But the original origin, these were what we now call black smokers. When you see on the Discovery or Learning Channel, and they talk about these underwater volcanoes that are spewing out the metals and forming, that's what these would have been many years ago. They're actually, the deposits there are older than the mountains. So they were laid down before the mountains formed and were actually changed by the formation of the mountains. We talk about copper. The copper is in this material, chalcopyrite, and it's only 4% chalcopyrite. It's only 2% copper if we break it down, but it's 25% sulfur. All of these minerals contain sulfur, and if you're familiar with the basin, you know making sulfuric acid became where our money was made. Early on, they didn't have the technology to recover the copper. They realized the sulfur was there from the beginning. We have documents and reports from the 1858, 59, 1860 era where they were talking about the potential for the sulfur, how valuable the sulfur is. They had no technical way of recovering the sulfur. So early on, they were only getting the copper out. And that led to a couple of problems because of the limits of technology. You notice there's not any trees in this photograph. This is about 1895 or so. The area was so remote, the only fuel source was the standing timber. So when they began mining in 1850, they began cutting the timber down and burning it to make charcoal, then using the charcoal to power their furnaces and run their steam engines. And of course some of the timber went for building houses for these 1,000 people that it came in, but the bulk of it went for fuel. By 1878, every tree for 50 square miles had been cut for fuel. That's about 30,000 acres if you wanted to put it in acres. Again, if you've been into the basin and you remember back when it was red and barren, that's the beginning of that happening. They cut all the standing timber for fuel. You know, charcoal's an inefficient fuel. They would have much rather used coal, but there was no rail line to get the coal to the basin. Initially, there wasn't even a road to the basin. You know, what we all call the river road today, or the road through the Ocoee Gorge, was actually cut in 1853 to link the mines in the basin to the railroad in Cleveland, because at that time the rail line had been extended to Cleveland, and they were hauling by wagon back and forth between those two communities, and it was a 2-day trip in a wagon to make that. If you've been along the river road, you saw that historic marker that says the halfway house. That's because that's about how far they could get in one day, and they would camp there overnight and then complete the trip afterwards. The early furnaces were pretty small. They were built out of local country rock, so these are small little smelting furnaces from the 1870s. On top of that, the smelters of that era couldn't recover the sulfur. We've already talked about that. And when we burn anything with sulfur, we get sulfur dioxide. We talk about acid rain today in our modern world. We're concerned with mainly coal, where we're burning coal. And in our world, it's coming off tall stacks and being spread over a wide area where you saw the level of that stack. So it's immediately coming back on the ground. But on top of that, you had to roast the ore prior to smelting it. And that was done in a heap on the ground. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time with the technical nature because I want to leave some time for questions. But just remember that what they were doing was state of the art for the era. You know, we love that word today. We go, oh, this is state of the art. Well, sometimes state of the art looks very primitive when we advance and we look back at it. But that open roasting technology they were using in the 1850s and 60s was the best method available at the time. This is the early photograph of the plant there at Copper Hill. Those are the first blast furnaces that they put in. That facility opened in 1899. Again, I've got some shots of the various mines and operations. Again, this was deep shaft mining. So that sign, 20N2, that means they're on the 20 level, which each level is times 100. So they're 2,000 foot down. And they're in what they call North 2. They're 200 feet north of the shaft. just like if you've been in the Navy and been on a large naval ship and they divide things by the spar and the beam and you can keep your bearings, they did the same thing in the mines using elevation and distance from shaft, whether you were north or south of the shaft. Over the course of mining in the basin, which the last mine closed in 1987. I just went blank there for a second. Yes, 1987. Over 90 million tons of ore were mined. There were 12 total deposits, 9 of them in Polk County, Tennessee, 3 smaller ones across the line in Fannin County, Georgia. Of course, the big product initially was copper, and this is a ladle pouring copper into one of the furnaces. This is in the modern era now, and you've got a 2-stage smelt. So you smelt it to about 50% pure, and you pour it out of that furnace and pour it into another furnace that takes it up to 99% pure. That's the community of Isabella around 1900, which at that time was the largest community in the basin. That's Ducktown around 1910. This is the beginnings of construction of the acid plant at Copper Hill. At the turn of the century, they began to develop some new technologies that let them recover the sulfur. And by 1904, they had that worked out. They started building acid plants in 1907, and after 1909, those plants were online. From that point forward, the companies made more money on the chemical division, making sulfuric acid and products from sulfuric acid than they did the metals, but we're still primarily known for copper mining in the region. But the reality was the sulfur is where the money was made. Something else that was a little bit unusual for the area, and certainly for this part of the South, these companies were organizing by the 1890s, and by the first decade of the 20th century, you had unions. Both companies at that time were organized. This is a photograph from the '39 strike. There were several strikes throughout the basin's history, but when people generally talk about the strike, they're talking about the '39 strike. And at that time, there had recently been a merger between the two operating companies. One of them had been organized under CIO, the other under AFL, because it was prior to those two groups joining. So the strike ended up being, in part, about who's representing the men, whether it was AFL or CIO. So it was almost like a three-legged fight. You had management on one side, and you had both unions fighting for because they're trying to build their membership. This is in the midst of a lot of organizing nationwide, and they're building membership. The guys were out there on the pickets and sort of heckling the guys that were coming in to trade. If you've ever been to the museum, this is the entrance coming up the hill from 68. It's down at the bottom of the hill. This is coming up the hill to the museum. That road was actually cut in 1939 during the strike to bypass the pickets. And if the locals, the old timers, still refer to that as Scab Road. Prior to that, employees came in a street back here and parked in this area, and management came in over the top of the hill and parked up top. And one morning they sent their company dozer down and cut a bypass so they could get their strike breakers on site to keep the operations going. Again, shot of Isabella, McPherson, Mary Mine. There were several operated. This is the construction of the acid plant at Copper Hill. At the time it was completed in 1910, it was the world's largest sulfuric acid plant. And you had people from all over the world coming to the basin to understand and study this technology. This was something new. They were using a smelter gas. They were using what had been a waste product, and converting it into a usable product. Prior to that time, most sulfuric acid that was manufactured was used by burning elemental sulfur. And they were actually capturing the sulfur coming off of their furnaces. And as you would imagine, purity is tough to get in an industrial setting. So the trick was dealing with the amount of copper that was still being released, along with nitrogen and some other elements. That's after it's operating. again, back into some of the mines. It's very large equipment, very large openings. I know growing up in West Tennessee, my idea of a mine was, you know, Roy Rogers and Gene, and they were always cramped up, and the timbers were overhead, and invariably one of them got knocked out during the fight, and part of the mine fell in. When we're dealing with hard rock mining, it's just that. It's very hard rock, and it rarely had to be braced or shored up. So you can see how large some of the openings were and how large some of the equipment was that they were using underground. Of course, you can't carry that down in one piece, so you carry it down in pieces and you reassemble it underground. So there were a lot of men whose job title included miner, but they weren't running a drill. They were keeping this equipment repaired. So you had machinists and welders and other men who worked underground, and their job was strictly to keep the equipment running. Because once you carried it down, you really didn't want to have to carry it back to the top to work on it, because that meant taking it apart again. And when they stopped mining in 1987, most of this equipment was abandoned in place. The cost of taking it apart and getting it out of the mines was more than the salvage value of it was worth. So when they stopped mining, almost all the equipment that had been used over those decades was just abandoned in place in the mines. Again, an idea of how large some of the openings were underground. The early days, they were mining pretty close to the surface, and as you go down, as you mature, you go at depth. You don't start at the bottom because the weight is so great. So you start at the top, and you're removing weight as you go, and that collapse off the overlook at the museum is a result of some of that early mining, where they basically went up to the dirt and didn't leave a lot of solid rock overhead. It didn't fail all at once. They weren't concerned about it failing because it was their property and they weren't going to go under it any longer once they finished that section. So it wasn't a big deal. Over at London, they decided to build a mill next to one of the mines and had a little problem one day. No one was injured. They backfilled that with material from the mines and kept right on going. Just pardon me, I'm gonna go through a bunch. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the land, because that's what everybody remembers, you know. The roasting released the sulfur dioxide, they cut the timber for fuel. The other factor was we're pretty mountainous. You've got about a 10-degree average slope on most of the land in the basin, so when it did rain, the water picked up a lot of velocity coming off that slope. And without any soil covering, it began to wash soil away. And we typically, as you know here in Cleveland, get about 50 to 60 inches of rain annually. And a lot of it comes in very intense events that can produce an inch or more within an hour. So they literally began to lose feet of soil every time it rained. This is one of those roast yards where they were heaping it up on the surface. That's the intermediate step before they had the technology to recover the acid. This was the end result. You not only had sheet erosion, but you had deep gully erosion occurring. Some of these gullies are 20 or more foot in depth. In 1907, you had one of the first environmental cases ever tried in this country as a result of the operations. They were suing, Georgia was suing more for agricultural damage rather than health damage. And the problem was all the mines were in Tennessee and all the tax money was being generated in Tennessee, and the prevailing winds were toward Georgia. So Georgia was sort of getting the short end of the stick. The courts ruled in their favor and gave them the right to place an injunction, but instead the company said, we'll just pay claims on a case-by-case basis if you want to enforce the injunction. And they did, and that persisted for decades. But this, if any of you remember the basin, this is probably the landscape you might remember. They lost, on average, we estimate today, over 6 feet of soil, on average, across that 50 square mile or that 30,000 acres. A gentleman from TVA told me they estimate it's enough topsoil to build a 8-foot wide roadbed from New York to Los Angeles. And again, some of those gullies were quite deep. They began reforestation in the 20s. You know, they developed new technology at the turn of the century. Now they're capturing the sulfur. Of course, something else happened in that period too. We got a railroad. So now we can buy coal. We're not having to cut timber any longer. But by the 20s, the air quality had improved enough that the companies began to think, you know, we can revegetate this. And they weren't under court order to do it, but there were pressures being brought to bear. And a lot of those pressures were the result of the hydroelectric plants going in on the Ocoee, which, if you remember, Parksville Lake and the Flume Line predate TVA. They were built by a private company called Tennessee Electric Power. They were concerned with all the sediment coming down the river and wearing out their turbines and silting in the dam there behind Parksville. So the companies began replanting in 29. In the 30s, you saw a lot of research as what would even grow here. The Virginia and loblolly pines came out giving the best results, and again, if you've been to the basin, you know that. And in 39, a new entity was on the ground, TVA, and the company began cooperating with them, because TVA, you know, we remember because we're in their area, but most people outside of our region think TVA is an electric power company. But you know, TVA was created mostly to improve river navigation on the Tennessee system, reduce flooding, and watershed management. And this fell very much in their watershed management duties. So they began setting out trees. To date, over 19 million trees have been set out in the basin. Now, all of those didn't live, obviously, because it still looked like this in the 60s. Now, this photograph is the 40s, and it still looked like this in the 60s. The problem was the erosion. There wasn't any topsoil left. And what they were planting in was sterile ground. They began to realize that. But in the 70s, we still showed up as a giant hotspot on an infrared photograph because there was no vegetation. If you want to get your bearings, that's Blue Ridge Lake. There's Parksville Lake. Up here's Appalachia. So in the 70s, they came up with some new techniques. They began to understand that there's fungi, microisals that live in the soil and plants need them. So they started putting them on the trees before they set them out. They started using time-release fertilizer tablets. They started an aerial seeding of different grasses to give some organic matter back to the soil. This is 1973. Those techniques were put into place in the early 80s. So they developed them in the 70s, the ones I just covered. Started using them in 81. By 1996, that's what that same area looked like. So that's pretty dramatic. Now, yeah, there's still some spots that need work, but you see the change. Most of you probably aware of the work that's been in the news a lot the last decade that Glen Springs Holdings is doing, cleaning up a lot of the old abandoned properties. These are the partners in that work. This is their project area. But it's not everything. It's something here. It's something here. It's like a quilt, and every square of the quilt needs different things done to it. But a lot of what they're doing are fencing. They've built, I think, about 10 miles of fence around areas that have caved to the surface or have the potential to cave to the surface in the future. They went in and did what they call a waste characterization. They looked at each site and determined what waste materials were there so they could develop a technique specific for that property. And then they began to apply that to that mosaic. There were areas where there was clean water, and then it was flowing through contaminated sections. So they began to divert clean water around those contaminated sections. And I'm not going to go into it, but that's what this is showing. They built a water treatment plant to treat the mine water. All the mines are flooded today. It's groundwater coming up. They treat that water before it's released out into the watershed. So they have pumps that hold it at the elevation you saw in that first photograph of that collapse. They don't let it rise to a level you get an outflow. Then they treat it. Treatment's real simple. It's add lime. The problem's the pH. So if they can add lime, they can get the acidity up. The metals fall out of solution. And of course, all of this is under state and EPA permit. So it's not like everybody takes their word for it. They have to demonstrate this works. But it works. Most of the mining in the basin was shaft, but they did a small open pit in the 70s. That's what we call South Pit. It's about a 1/4 mile long and 200 foot deep. There's a shaft mine 3,000 foot below it, so it's just a little top. But rather than build a clarifier when they built their water treatment plant, they use this for their clarifier. So the water treatment plant's over here. And you can see the discharge of the water and the amount of iron. See how red that is? The pH is so different than the water in the pit, it falls to the bottom. It can't dissolve back into the water that's held in that pit. So that's how they can discharge into that. And the bottom of the pit collapsed into the mine. So it doesn't stop at the bottom of the pit, it's actually feeding into the mine. They've been using that for about 7 years now, and their depth soundings haven't changed, so they know it's feeding into the mine, otherwise the bottom would be coming up. I want to jump real quick. This is some areas where they've done work. This is below the plant there at Copper Hill. You see what it looked like in the late 90s. You see what that area looks like today. This was over at Mary Mine. That's what it looked like in the 90s. That's what it looks like today. That's off the museum overlook at the McPherson area where one of those roast yards have been located. Again, this is a photograph from the 90s. This is a photograph from today. So each place needs a different approach. And they're doing stream restorations. There's the creeks there were all channelized, so they were straightened out. So they're putting them back in the original channels, and once they do that, they return the native plants and the aquatic species you would find. So you go from something that looked like this during construction to this. And that's where it is today. That's over at Isabella, again, 93. There it is today. Now you go, well, what's happening up here? That's that high wall. It's tough to get up there and plant trees. So Mother Nature's working on it. Probably take a little bit longer to get that. That is a collapse over on the mine at Isabel's, what's happening in that photograph. But anyway, I know that was a lot of stuff, but anybody got any questions? Yes, sir.
I spoke to a man, a friend of mine, he used to work in the mine, and he said that there was some large cavern underneath there that had stuff in the ceiling the size of watermelons that would fall every now and then.
That's what they refer to as loose ground or bulk ground. Again, in a hard rock mine, you typically don't see the total roof failures, but you do get pieces that scab or scale off. And those openings they created were called stopes, where they remove all the material. And that was the biggest risk to a hard rock miner, is what they call loose or bulk ground. You try to check for that. You have men that actually go in and tap in those areas. And in the 30s, you went to what's called sub-level stoping, where you don't directly work under that. You move it out and you retreat back and you let it fall to a draw point. But there were still times that men would have to go in there for some reason, and that's the risk. But you know, a piece this size is going to weigh 30 or 40 pounds, and it's just part of the inherent risk of the occupation.
The slag that came out of the mines, there was truckloads of that being sent over to barges to go to China.
It's not the slag, it's what we call calcine. I didn't go into that in detail, but there's a lot more iron sulfide in the ore than copper sulfide, and it's in the form of pyrite, fool's gold. And we always separated that from the 20s on. They would separate that and they would heat it enough to burn the sulfur off, because they wanted that for the acid, and they were left with an iron oxide that's called calcine. It's rust. It's a reddish brown powder. The problem is our iron is pretty low grade, and it wasn't good enough to make steel from by itself, but for decades we sold it to Birmingham. They would put it on trains, they would center it so it'd get into clumps, and they would send it to Birmingham, and Birmingham would blend it with other sources of iron and run it through the steel mills. The problem was, by the 60s, the mills in Alabama started buying iron ore from the Great Lakes states, from Wisconsin and Minnesota, that was better than the product coming out of the Copper Basin, and we lost the market. So the last 20 years or so that they mined, they had no market for the calcine, and they piled up millions of tons of it on the surface, and put dirt on it, and sowed grass on it so the wind didn't blow it away, and it sat there for the next 30 years. But when you get to about 2005, 2006, all of a sudden, the price of iron has gone up, the demand for iron has gone up globally, and people became interested in buying it again. So they're trucking it to Chattanooga to put it on barges, and from there it goes down to Tennessee to the Ten-Tom Canal to Mobile, where it goes on a boat, and I'm sure everyone can guess where that boat goes. It goes to China. And they're doing the same thing with it that Birmingham did. They're mixing it with other sources of iron to go through and make steel. You know, we still make a little steel in this country, but what we make is very high grade specialty steel, and this is not a suitable feed for that. But it's a product that they lost the market for, and then the market came back. But now it's a global market where it used to be a domestic market. Now they are still selling slag as well, but that generally leaves in trains, and that's going to construction materials companies. It goes in rock wool, which is an insulation material that they replaced asbestos in a lot of applications with. But all those freight trains are trucks, and that's what I call them, because they get nose to tail. And they started running again last week. You know, they don't run all the time. The world market has to be just right, and China has to want some. And they've locked part of it up under contract. I've been told they're negotiating to lock the balance of it up under contract as well. But China buys it on delivery. They don't buy it in Copper Hill. They buy it when the boat docks in China. But it's not a mystery. They don't have to get out on the dock and go, hey, we've got a load of iron. Who wants to buy it? They know when it gets there it's sold. But that's what they're hauling out in those trucks, is the iron portion. Yes?
My grandfather was a coal miner, and of course black lung was what got him. What was the main health concern?
Hard rock miners, it's silicosis from breathing rock dust. It's similar, but there's a couple of differences. One, the coal is a carcinogen, so a lot of those guys ended up with lung cancers, where silica is not. So our guys ended up with pneumonia, emphysema, what we call COPD today. It's an abrasive, it scars your lungs, you can't breathe as deep, so you start to not being able to breathe, and then you get the other health risks. So it was recognized by the turn of the century. The state was requiring dust counts by the first decade of the 1900s. Of course, what they'd allow in the air in 1910 and what they'd allow in the air today were very different numbers. They began wet drilling in the teens in the basin to control it, or attempt to control it. The drills pushed water out the bit, so when you drilled the rock, you kept it from being so dusty. But with all that said, it's not until the 70s that respirators and masks become mandatory. So if you're talking about a miner prior to World War II, he almost certainly suffered silicosis. If you're talking about a miner prior to the 70s, he probably suffered silicosis. Yes?
Are they still doing the hydrochloric acid?
No. They stopped making acid in 2001. When they stopped mining, they continued making acid, buying raw sulfur and shipping it in. But sulfuric acid is the most widely used chemical in the world. Because it's so widely used, it's widely manufactured. And you tend to make it close to who you're selling it to. And by 2000 or so, a lot of the customers that historically the plant in Copper Hill had sold to were gone. They were the textile industries. We don't make textiles in the South any longer. It was fertilizer and agrochemical companies. We don't farm as much, or we can farm less land and produce more food. So they stopped making sulfuric acid in 2000. The other associated lines, they began to make things from sulfuric acid as well. Those began to phase out, and the last line closed in 2008. So they have not made a product since 2008. But they're selling stuff they have stockpiled, and the company that owns the facility now is actually cutting it down for salvage, for scrap too, because you know, you can make money doing that these days. You can pay a man to cut a building down and another man to haul it out, and you can still make profit. So, I know we've run over. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. It's always interesting because having grown up in the basin, Turtletown's real home, talking about it, Isabella and some of the other stuff, everybody gets all wound up about asbestos, and I'll tell you the reason why. My grandpa Lyles had asbestos. He said everything else under the sun wrong with him. He worked over the Isabella plant. This is where he worked over there. But they used to literally mix up that asbestos, just like you would Quickcrete, in essence. Usually with raw hands, didn't have anything on, those kinds of things. It's amazing how things have changed from 20s, 30s, 40s, even the 60s to a certain degree, until the EPA came into existence, and then OSHA regulations coming down the pike too. So just kind of an interesting little tidbit on all that, but thank you for being here, Ken. Reminder, Foundation annual meeting, Tuesday noon up here on February the 12th. Regular meetings next week, same time, same back channel, as they say. And Suzanne Wood from over at Cleveland State regarding the 10th anniversary of the celebration here locally of Dr. Seuss Day, where we're participating on 710 books. Once again, it's how many that we from our funds, $3,750, that we're giving to those folks from our labors in this club. We'll have 710 books, how much they'll be able to purchase. So just want to let you know that too. Any other announcements, anything else from the floor? Seeing none, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you.
Yeah. Good to see y'all. You have a good 150 years in the 20 minutes.
We'll learn that one. I'm gonna know.